I'm Carl Blumstein. I'm the director of the CITRIS Energy Initiative, and I'm pleased to be able to introduce today's speaker. But first, welcome to our web viewers. We have web viewers on 3 other campuses, and an announcement on April 8th. We will have a poster session with the finalists of our CITRIS Big Ideas competition, 3 p.m. in the atrium. Today's speaker, we're delighted to have a speaker with very, very strong Berkeley connections. I guess he's got some members of the family in the audience who've been long associated with Berkeley. He is David Hochschild, who was appointed by Governor Jerry Brown to the California Energy Commission in February of 2013. Commissioner Hochschild's career has spanned public service, environmental advocacy, and the private sector. He first got involved in the solar energy field in 2001 in San Francisco as a special assistant to Mayor Willie Brown, where he launched a citywide $100 million initiative to put solar panels on public buildings. He went on to co-found the Vote Solar Initiative, a 60,000-member advocacy organization promoting solar policies at the local, state, and federal level. He served as executive director of a national consortium of leading solar manufacturers and worked for 5 years at Solaria, a solar company in Silicon Valley. In 2007-2008, he served as a commissioner at the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission. For his work to advance clean energy, Commissioner Hochschild was awarded the Sierra Club's Trailblazer Award, the American Lung Association's Clean Energy Hero Award, and the Department of Energy's Million Solar Roof True Champion Award. Commissioner Hochschild holds a BA degree from Swarthmore College and a Master of Public Policy degree from Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, and was a Coro Fellow in Public Affairs. Please welcome Commissioner Hochschild.
Thank you, Carl. I think, is this on? I think I'm good. You guys all hear me okay? All right, good afternoon, and thank you to Carl and to the CITRIS Center for the invitation. Good to be with you. So I want to talk a bit about the success story, actually, of renewable energy in California. And by way of introduction, I just want to begin just with a few thoughts about hope in the era of climate change, because I think it's clear to everybody paying attention that the news is not good. And last year was the hottest year on record. We're going through the worst drought in California history, and there's a lot of things out there that I think are depressing, and it's perfectly natural to feel dispirited. But what I think we're meant to do in this moment is actually draw hope from what is going well. And there are a lot of success stories that I think are inspiring. And I think we need to actually get excited about how tough this challenge is. And I want to walk through today some of what I think we can all draw strength from, because there is actually hope, and I actually think a lot of it is happening here in California. So with that, I'll just give a little bit of introduction of my background, how I got into the energy field. I'm actually very fortunate to be joined. Both my parents showed up for this, so they're both affiliated with Berkeley. My mother taught sociology at UC Berkeley for her whole career. My father teaches a class at the journalism school right next door. And in the late 90s, he was writing about South Africa and actually took me with him on a reporting trip just before the first elections in South Africa. And I got really excited about the country. Ended up deciding to go back and work for a year for President Mandela's youth program in a township on the Eastern Cape. And one of the first things that Mandela did, and the ANC government did, when they took power, was provide mail service to the townships where there wasn't access to postal service for much of the country. And these were all solar-powered postal stations, and they were lit with batteries at night, and became, in the community where I was living, kind of a gathering spot at night. And I just kind of got excited about the connection between solar and democracy and the ability to have distributed power. And that was kind of, for me, really my first sort of interest in solar technology. I went on to work in San Francisco for Mayor Willie Brown in 2001 during the energy crisis. We were having rolling blackouts, and a bunch of us got together and decided it was a good opportunity to do a big push for renewables in the city. And we put together a $100 million bond to do solar panels and energy efficiency on public buildings. The picture at the top is the Hunters Point power plant, which for years was a sore point in the Hunters Point community, low-income African-American, predominantly African-American community, that really bears the brunt of the environmental burden in San Francisco. The sewage treatment plant is out there and all sorts of other toxic and noxious facilities, and this power plant was a real sore point, and the community fought really hard to shut it down. The solar program, and I'm happy to report, both that facility and its neighbor, the Potrero power plant, were ultimately shut down. In its place, a very large solar program was established, and you see the picture on the top right is the Sunset Reservoir, which is a 5-megawatt solar roof. Below that is the solar roof on the Moscone Convention Center, which at the time was the largest solar roof in the country. This is the solar roof on the airport, and they're just now installing actually solar on City Hall in San Francisco. One other thing, just a little bit of context before we get into renewables, is just about federal subsidies, because people often ask the question about subsidies for energy, and I think often it's the wrong question. And the question that I hear the most is, what's the subsidy this year? Okay, which I actually don't think is the right question. The real question is, what is the all-in subsidy since inception, right? And basically, the story is we've been subsidizing fossil fuels for nearly a century. And renewable subsidies, basically there's three fundamental differences between subsidies for fossil and nuclear and subsidies for renewables. The subsidies for fossil fuel and nuclear are much more numerous, for one thing, and they've been around much longer. And most importantly, they typically don't expire. Okay, so you have things like the oil depletion allowance, which exists in perpetuity. The Price-Anderson Act for nuclear, which shifts the risk of a nuclear meltdown onto the ratepayers, that doesn't go away. But you have subsidies for renewables, like the investment tax credit, which expires next year, and the production tax credit for wind, which has already expired. And this sort of stop-start cycle, I think, has really hindered what would have otherwise been a more rapid growth that we're seeing in renewables. So in many ways, the success that's happening in renewables is happening in spite of and not because of the federal policy landscape. So with that as background, I just want to talk about where we're going right now in California. So California established really the first bold RPS in the country, originally just set to do 20% renewables by 2013. Then the first law that Governor Brown signed when he came into office just over 4 years ago for his second tour of duty was the 33% RPS to get to 33% renewables by 2020. And we're now fully contracted to reach that goal. And then in January, at his inaugural speech, he laid out a really bold goal to get to 50% renewables by 2030 and keep the momentum going. And by the way, that's one of three goals. The other two goals he laid out for energy were to cut our use of oil for transportation in half by 2030 and to double energy efficiency for existing buildings. So there's a bit of a contest as to which of those bold goals is actually the toughest, because they're all steep climb. But it's exciting, and I think actually in the case of renewables, it's absolutely achievable. So I just want to point out also, we are, the reason this matters is California is so big. I just came up with this stat as I was doing some research, but we basically have a bigger population in California than 163 out of the 196 countries in the world. So we're big enough to essentially incubate the clean energy industry of the future and get it to scale, and that's precisely what's happening today. You have companies like Solar City that didn't exist prior to our policies being put in place, and they get established 2006 or 7, and now they're the largest solar installer in the world, and they're hiring 500 people a month. And that's really a consequence of the policy we're able to create in California, which helps bring the cost down, which helps export it to other states. So there's also a great history of taking on big energy challenges in the past. And I just want to recap the story, what happened in the early 70s. So we had a huge problem in the early 70s, which was electric load was growing. Electric demand's growing at 8% a year. And nobody quite knew what to do. And the legislature commissioned the RAND Corporation to study the issue. And their answer was build 40 nuclear plants. That's basically the way to solve this problem. So we have an 800-mile coastline in California. That would have meant a nuclear plant every 20 miles along the coast. And so the governor and the legislature said, no, we're going to go a different direction. And by the way, you go back 40 years ago, the governor was a guy by the name of Jerry Brown, who had taken over from a Republican movie star. At that point, it was Ronald Reagan. This time it was Arnold Schwarzenegger. And Jerry Brown actually appointed the very first commissioners of the California Energy Commission, which was born out of that desire to go in a different direction and to get serious about efficiencies and renewables. So 5 nuclear plants were built in California. Only 1 is still operating. Okay, so we don't have 40. We have 1. And the Energy Commission, its first thing that was focused on at that time was to do efficiency for buildings and appliances. And I just want to walk you through what actually happened. So we were basically, demand was essentially correlating with demand in the rest of the country. Okay, so California is in blue, and the rest of the U.S. is in red there. And in part because of these strict energy efficiency standards, we ended up saving all this energy. So now we're using half the energy per capita of the rest of the country. That's not the energy standards aren't the only reason, but it was a major reason, and it's a big success story. So the footprint's a lot lighter than it would have otherwise been. And a little bit about how these work. So you look at your biggest energy hog in your home is your refrigerator, as you know. Okay, so this was electric demand in the refrigerators up until the point where the first refrigerator standards were created. The refrigerator industry resisted mightily. I talked to the commissioner who was at the Energy Commission at that time pushing the standards. He described their response as, his word was fury. Okay, but the standard did get created, and this is what happened. So energy use plummeted because of the standard, and at the same time, the price of the refrigerator went down as well. Okay, so using less power, it's costing less, and the size of the refrigerator is going up. So it's a really win-win-win. And I think we're in this era where government is demonized so much, but this is a great success story of, I think, the positive results you can get from smart policy. Same thing with other appliances in your home. For example, 2009, we created the standard for television sets. Okay, so you can't sell, and there's a lot of leverage with these big manufacturers because we have 40 million customers, and we basically say you can't sell your product into our state to our 40 million customers unless you meet this strict efficiency standard, and that saves, for the television standard, saves $1 billion a year for ratepayers. And the same thing with plug-in chargers. That standard was put in place in 2012. So anybody who has a shaver or a cell phone plugged into a wall prior to 2012, when the device was fully charged, it would continue to draw power. Why? Because there's a 25-cent shutoff diode that could stop that the manufacturer is not electing to install because they don't pay the energy bill. You do. So we said you can't sell that product into the state without that shutoff diode, and that saves $300 million a year. So a lot of the stuff is very below the radar, but it turns out to be hugely significant. Also, huge improvement with LEDs. The Energy Commission set a quality standard for LEDs that's now been met, and so you have basically this one on the right is made by Cree, has essentially the same light quality, but it lasts for 20 plus years and uses 80% less energy. And when we're more efficient, by the way, it also is more likely to keep people in their homes. So you are 32% less likely to default on your mortgage when you're living in an energy efficient home. So all this happens before we get to renewables because that's the priority in the state. And one final point, we're actually using, our electric bills are lower than the national average, about 20% lower. People, don't actually care about rates at the end of the day. They care about their bill, and because even if the rate is a little higher, the bill is lower because you're using less of that energy. So on renewables, we are basically doing these sort of energy equivalent of extreme home makeover. It's just been a huge transformation. Really, you just go back to 2008, we were at 12% renewables in California, and in December we had 25%. So more than doubled in just that period, 6-year period. And we've now installed more renewables than any other state in the country. So we are the Saudi Arabia of solar, wind, and geothermal. We're very blessed to have those resources and have land to deploy these large-scale systems, and it's made a huge difference. So I just want to take you on a tour of some of these projects, because so many of these are coming online right now. So this is actually the world's largest thin film PV project, and I was fortunate to be able to dedicate that with the Secretary of Interior just 6 weeks ago or so. It's out in the desert in Riverside County, and they were installing this at a rate of a megawatt a day. So I spent my career prior to this in Silicon Valley in the solar industry. It used to be that, if you were doing a megawatt a year as a small solar company, that was good business. So the scale has just gotten enormous, and now even over the course of the project, you see these little technology improvements and cost reductions that they were able to make. When they started making the project, they had frames around the modules. They were able to get rid of the frames, little things like that. They were originally grading the whole site, and now for future projects, they're not doing that. So you save another 15% on that. This project is a fixed tilt project, so it's not moving. The efficiency of the panels got so good, it actually makes sense to track going forward. So you get about 25% more power from the same panels. So all these things are happening in real time. This is the world's largest silicon PV project, which is going to be dedicated in the next few months. And this is a high-efficiency crystalline silicon technology. This is a SunPower technology. The last one I showed you was a thin film first solar technology. So this will be 579 megawatts in Kern County. And by the way, when you think of Kern County in California, if you're native California, you always think oil. At least I always did. But it turns out the second largest taxpayer in Kern County is wind now, and this project will now be a huge contributor to the local economy as well. So this is the world's largest solar thermal power plant. So this is a solar thermal tower project called the Ivanpah project. And what you're looking at there are 3 550-foot towers surrounded by 173,000 heliostats. So you basically have all these individual heliostat mirrors are on an algorithm. So when the sun hits the mirror, it focuses on the top of the tower where the boiler is and heats it up. And you have a steam generator. And so it actually ends up being the second brightest thing visible from the face of the Earth after the sun when it's energized. It's incredible. You can't actually look at it without sunglasses. And there was all sorts of controversies about this, as you can imagine. But it's the largest of its kind in the world. And just the engineering alone, they actually build into that. Each tower has a 110-ton counterweight because it can't move off its position. So like a big ship, it actually can counterbalance when the wind comes up. So extraordinary engineering. This is the world's largest solar thermal trough plant. This is actually not new. This is almost 30 years old. This is called the SEGS project. And this is just a parabolic trough mirror that focuses the light on that tube in the middle, and you're superheating the synthetic oil to 800 degrees. And I think it's noteworthy, that it's been around for almost 30 years and it's still going strong. So I've personally visited every single one of these facilities. I think this one is a real testimony to the durability of renewables. And finally, we have the world's largest geothermal power plant is also in California. This is close by, right up there in the Napa Lake County region, the geysers. It's about 1 gigawatt in size. And this is the world's largest iron chromium flow battery. So for those of you not familiar with flow batteries, it's basically a vat that's filled with electrolyte, and it can hold a charge. So this is adjacent to a solar power project in Turlock, where they do a lot of water pumping for the almond groves. California produces 80% of the world's almonds, and so they have a lot of water pumping, and that on periods where there's surplus power from the sun, it goes in, it can be stored in this utility scale battery. It has about a 70% round trip efficiency. And this, is really part of this. One of the criticisms of renewables is that you have all this intermittent power, and there's many levers that can be pulled to deal with that. But storage is a very important one of those, and the costs of this technology are coming down. So I'm very optimistic about the future of storage. And then we also have the world's largest wind project, also in Kern County. This is a gigawatt and a half in Kern County, and as I said, is the second largest taxpayer now in that region. So really in every technology, clean energy technology generation category, California has the largest project in the world, which is, I think, something we can all be proud of. There is, however, impact for all renewables. We hear a lot about bird kill. I just want to put this on because it is important to note that bird deaths from winds are literally less than 0.1%. Cats are 75% of the. So just to keep in contact, we hear this a lot, but it's actually something that the industry is still taking very seriously. And I want to just tell this story. This project is called Vasco, and this is actually very close, just 45 minutes away from here. And what they did, the early turbines had this lattice-like structure, which was a sort of perching opportunity for birds, and the blades had a very high RPM, about 45 RPM. Okay, the new turbines have a solid steel column, and it's about 12 RPM typically. And so what they did is they actually had these 432 the small turbines. They removed all those in this repowering and replaced them with 34 of the new turbines. And it tripled the energy production and cut avian mortality by 70%. Okay, and I think that's a great example of how we are actually, because there are impacts for renewables. For every type of renewable has some sort of environmental impact as well, but that we're able to lower the footprint of this impact, and I think that's very promising. In solar, one of the exciting developments is what's happening in new home construction. So we're building about 115,000 new homes are expected to be built in California this year. That's more homes than any year in the state since 2006. So the market's really coming back. And we have a big program called the New Solar Homes Partnership that the Energy Commission runs to encourage the builders and provide incentives for them to build with solar. And in California, 27% of the homes built last year, new homes built, were done with solar, which is I think a really exciting development. And you see it leverages a lot of the builders they're now, because they start with solar, then they actually end up building and marketing the homes as green communities. So they do, solar ends up kind of being the gateway drug that gets the builders into doing much more, including LED windows and electric vehicle chargers. And they even have refrigerators that know if you're on a time of use rate and your rates are higher from 12 to 6 in the afternoon, the refrigerator knows that and will actually pre-cool your refrigerator, run it harder up until noon, and then be off during the peak hours to save money. So it's sort of an example of smarter, greener design that's happening now. Also, the largest manufacturing plant in California today of any type is an electric vehicle factory. So this is the Tesla plant, which now employs 11,000 people at Tesla, 8,000 in California. Just to remember, this plant, which is down in Fremont, used to be the joint venture of Toyota and General Motors, and employed 5,000 people. And when it went out of business in 2009, 2010 timeframe, people thought that was the end of auto manufacturing in California, and desperate search for what to replace it. Tesla came in, bought the facility, and they're scaling up. And now we have over 100,000 electric vehicles and plug-in electric vehicles and plug-in hybrids in California. And by the way, for that, they're able. One of the nice things is, as the technology advances, they're able to actually onshore manufacturing processes that were previously overseas. So I went and saw when they're making the batteries and so on. We saw processes that were done in Asia a year ago and now have been brought to California because the automation has gotten so good. So in electric vehicles, we're now literally the market for electric vehicles is bigger in California than in any other country in the world. We're second only to the U.S. as a whole. And there's some innovation there. We funded this bus company, Proterra, which has an electric bus that is designed to go 2 full city bus routes, so 30 miles on a charge, and then recharge in the time it takes a driver to have a bathroom break. So 10 minutes. It's got a 440-volt charger on the roof for fast charging. And of course, battery costs are coming down significantly. This is a slide from Panasonic, but of course, the Tesla battery factory, which is now being built in Nevada, is the biggest battery factory, lithium-ion battery factory in the world, and we're very hopeful that will help drive down the costs even faster. So in terms of job growth, one of the exciting things is what's happening in particular in the solar industry. Last year we passed a very important milestone. There's actually more employees working in the California solar industry than work for the 3 big investor-owned utilities, which is PG&E and Southern California Edison and SDG&E. And that number, which is about 55,000 today, is expected to grow to close to I think 68,000 by the end of this year. When you look at the generation portfolio of renewables, this is kind of the projection of where we think things will land. Basically, what you see here is the single biggest thing that's happening within the renewable portfolio, that tan band, which is solar PV. That's growing, and so by 2020, we project about half of all the utility scale renewables in the state will be represented by solar, and that's really a function of the cost reduction that's been happening. Costs are driven downward by 3 things: innovation, automation, and scale. And so all 3 of those are happening at the same time, and arguably the most significant has just been scale. China's getting to bigger scale factories than anybody else has ever gotten to, and that's played a huge role. And at the same time, there's been all these other cost reductions because of new innovation. So I sort of think about this price barrier. It sort of reminds me of Roger Bannister breaking the 4-minute mile. In 1954, everyone said that was a line that could not be crossed. No human could run a mile in under 4 minutes, and he did it. And then as soon as he did it, 46 days later, the record got broken again. So I think that's kind of what I've seen happening with solar pricing. It just, people keep saying it can't go any lower, and then it has. So every time, essentially, global demand for solar has doubled, the price goes down about 20%, and that price history trend has actually held true for the last 35 years, and I think it's going to continue to hold true for some while longer. So it's been basically a solar panel today costs 98% less than it did in 1980. All right. Sort of similar to what happened with cell phones, I'd like to use this example. And AT&T did a global market study in 1980 that there would be 900,000 cell phone subscribers in the year 2000, and there ended up being 109 million, and today there's almost 7 billion. And this is one of those things that's now ubiquitous, and I think we're headed that way with PV.
It was actually a McKinsey report that did that.
It was a McKinsey report. There you go. Did for AT&T. So were you involved with that, or?
No, it's a classic case.
Yeah.
It said only 500,000 phones at best will
Yep.
be sold, and so AT&T actually sold their services.
Yep.
What they were looking at was the brick phones rather than the flip phones that we became. So it's kind of how technology evolves.
Yep. Well, our ability to see the future, I think, is often not as clear as we'd like. So I want to just go back to sort of one of the foundational policies that I think is going to lay the basis and already has laid the basis for a much more distributed future, which is net metering. So this is the first net metered house in the United States that was done in 1980. And so net metering is basically the arrangement that we have in California where when you install solar or wind on your property, you are guaranteed to get an equal credit equal to what you'd otherwise pay for the utility for the power you feed back onto the grid for the benefit of other customers. That policy is now in 43 different states. We have over 300,000 net metered systems in California, and that's really been why the distributed generation market has been so strong in our state. The latest solar customer, by the way, is the White House. So this is the solar roof that President Obama put on last spring on the White House. Some very exciting stuff happening in the military. So California has about 30 military bases, and the Navy in particular, I think, has really distinguished itself. So they have a really ambitious goal to get to 50% renewables by 2020, and they're doing all kinds of large-scale projects, and in addition, big efficiency efforts. So often, like I've visited a number of their bases, and they describe scenarios where you have two identical class destroyers that would dock next to each other, and one is using twice as much energy in port as the other. And it's really just a behavioral point. So they're really just focused now on grading out even the officers on their energy use of their ships, which is an interesting approach. So also in renewables is very exciting. There will be 100% renewable power for high-speed rail, which is the governor's absolutely committed to making high-speed rail happen. Construction, as I think most of you know, is already underway for that, and we're in a period now of basically continuous construction of high-speed rail from now until when it gets completed. And the commitment has been made for the electricity that supplies that to be 100% renewable, and for each individual station along the route to be a zero net energy building. So some very bold commitments there as well. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about the new economy and energy, because I think there's some interesting parallels. If you look, I think you make a case that you can kind of define the new economy in a few ways. It tends to be decentralized business model, heavily technology-based, growing rapidly, and meeting very strong resistance from incumbents. Okay, so I just picked out Uber and Airbnb as examples here. So neither of these companies was around 10 years ago. Uber today is valued at $40 billion. Okay, so just for comparison, like Ford is 65 billion, right? So GM is like 50 billion. So they're really in stratospheric territory. Airbnb is valued at about 20 billion, and these charts here show this is the number of Uber drivers, and that's the number of listings on the Airbnb site, and you can just kind of see the trend that we're going. But yet, both these companies, which are proven very popular with consumers, have met really mighty resistance, and I think that's similar to sort of what we're seeing in the energy field, and it kind of raises the question, how exactly will the new economy manifest itself in the energy sector? What does that really look like? One example, Tesla is probably the star child of this example. This is General Motors was founded in 1908, and so it took them over a century to become a $50 billion company. Tesla was founded in 2003, and is already at half that. So you can kind of see the direction it's going. So rapid growth is there's already examples of that. But a few of the other things that I think are going to define the new energy economy, there are some very, if you think about like Uber, for example, okay? I just took my first Uber ride this summer, and someone showed me how to download the app. I did it. The car was there in 2 minutes. It was about 30% cheaper than a taxi, and then afterwards, you can rate the driver, and the driver rates you, and this whole thing. And it's totally cashless transaction, right? It's all through phones, and so you realize the whole business is really predicated upon smartphones, right? You wouldn't have Uber or Lyft these rides without a smartphone. It really enables that. And I think in the same way, we now have smart meters in California. We spent $5 billion deploying smart meters across the state, and that's going to actually engender some new businesses. So one of them, the chart on the right, is from a company called Bidgely. Can you raise your hand if you've ever heard of Bidgely? So a handful of people, yeah. So what they do is basically get this 10-second data from the smart meter, and actually it reads like an EKG of your house. Each big appliance in your house has an identifiable energy signature. You can look at this and see, okay, that's your washer, that's your dryer, that's your refrigerator, that's your toaster, this is your dishwasher, and also what vintage it is. So they can tell you, they give you much more prescriptive efficiency upgrades. Like they can see, okay, this is you appear to be running a 1970s vintage, freezer, and if you upgrade to a new model, you'll save 60%. So right now, our approach on energy efficiency is very much a shotgun approach, and I think this can engender a much more customer-specific energy efficiency option. So I'm very hopeful about this next wave of companies like that. The picture on the left is a company called View. Can you raise your hand if you ever heard of View? Okay, so 1 or 2 people. Okay, so these guys have raised $400 million. They're down in San Jose, and what they've invented is an electrostatic window that lets you tint it. You can control. You can turn it from basically completely dark to completely clear. Okay, and so that saves about 20%. By the way, it totally eliminates the need for curtains or blinds, for one thing, but it saves about 20% on your energy bill by reducing heat gain. And so as we push forward to new, greener building, technologies like that, they're really new entrants, I think, are going to be very helpful. And then, of course, electric vehicle charging is, I think, a very exciting possibility around that. The model for years has been that electric generation follows electric demand, okay? But when we have generation that's not totally within our control, like wind or solar, to some extent it can flip the script, and you have some flexibility on when you run different devices, including your electric vehicle. You just want it to be charged in the morning, or you want it charged during some period of the day. It can introduce the possibility of electric demand actually following renewable energy generation, which is kind of an interesting note. So it's also, we're getting much greener. Obviously, the rest of the country is actually starting to follow California. And this is a projection that was just released by the Energy Information Administration that's projecting that renewables are going to be 70% of the new electric generation capacity added in the U.S. in 2015. Last year, they were 53%. So I think that's a hopeful sign as well. I want to just touch on the drought. We are in the worst drought in state history, and it's worth noting about 20% of our energy that we spend in California is spent moving water or wastewater. And so it's very important to reduce water use, because you're also actually reducing pollution when you do that, and you're reducing energy use. And so one of the things we do, we have about 10 appliances. I was talking earlier about appliances. We actually regulate a lot of water appliances, including toilets and faucets and washing machines and so on. And we save about 2 million acre-feet a year from those appliance efficiency standards. And we're constantly working to strengthen those. So I'll close with a few tales that I find inspiring, and then we can open it up to Q&A. So I grew up in the summers going to visit my grandfather, who lived in the middle of the Adirondack Park, which is the largest state park in the United States in upstate New York. And I swam there, I fished there, and there's about 1,800 lakes in that park, and 25% of those lakes died because of acid rain. And what happened in the 70s and 80s in the Midwest, they were to deal with a local air pollution problem. They put higher smokestacks on the power plants, and that got the pollution up in the jet stream and really took it over to the Northeast. And it had this acidification of the lakes happening. And so scientists studying this phenomenon, they noticed the loon is the iconic bird of the Adirondacks. They found a pair of loons that were raising a chick in a lake where all the fish had died, and the parents were having to fly to other lakes to get fish to bring back, and the chick couldn't survive because they'd never learned how to swim. So this is the kind of thing, learned how to fish on its own. So this is the kind of thing that was happening. Then George Bush Sr., to his great credit, signed the cap and trade to deal with this problem in 1990, and we've seen a huge improvement in acid rain. And so basically, today there's been something like a 65 or 70% reduction in sulfur dioxide emissions, and the lakes that were dead are coming back to life. And I think it's a real success story of how smart policy can actually work. Similarly, with the ozone hole, which everyone's heard about. In 1987, to deal with chlorofluorocarbons, the Montreal Protocol was signed, and today we're on track by 2050 for the ozone hole to completely restore. And finally, with smoking, you look at something like smoking, where in World War II, soldiers were given free cigarettes as part of their daily rations in the war. Doctors did ads for cigarettes. Nurses did ads. Presidents smoked. Celebrities smoked. And sometimes they smoked together. And then the science became clear that, hey, smoking causes cancer, and secondhand smoke causes cancer. And the tobacco industry responded by putting $100 million into junk science to dispute that basic fact. And that had the effect of delaying, but not ultimately stopping, this cavalcade of policies to reduce smoking. And it started with warnings on packages and cigarette advertising being banned from TV, the cigarette tax and banning smoking on airplanes and sale to minors, and one thing after another. And so we went from basically half of the country smoking to today we're down to 18%, and it's projected to fall to 12% by 2020. This is really one of the great success stories. And again, it comes from sound science being followed up on with bold policy. But it's a great reminder of, I think, what's possible. So with that, I'll stop and take any questions.
For the microphone, let me see here. We have a question.
I'll just share two ideas that I have that would increase the solar adaptation. One is make them look like roofing panels and integrate in, because I have a feeling that in 10 years a lot of people are going to rip these things off because they're not aesthetic. And so if you made it functional, maybe collecting water, heating water, and being a solar panel and looking like a roof that people can carry out to the next generation. And the other one is the same meter that you had with electricity. The water also has the same fingerprints. So you can see if there's a leaky toilet, especially with apartments and things where generally the tenants don't pay for the water, so they don't really care, but you can have like the fingerprint, okay, there's a leaky toilet or the sink is leaking and things like that. And I think we can do a fair amount to contribute to the reduction of water in the state using those kind of technologies.
Those
what are your comments on that?
Both great suggestions. Yep.
Thanks for the talk. I really enjoyed it. One quick question to decarbonize, ultimately, in the long run, the energy sector. Natural gas being cheap is a problem because for heating, water heating, as well as low temperature applications like pasteurizing of citrus fruits and juices in California would be great. So do you have any idea of, or suggestions as to how that's going to happen? And the second, I have a quick second question is, of course, transportation sector is one sector which the carbon emissions in the state is higher than the country. It's 40% of the emissions is in California as against 30%, and that again, what do you see as a trajectory for decarbonizing that? Thanks.
Yeah, so on natural gas, natural gas is cheap if you don't count all the costs. Okay, I think at a minimum we need to count all the costs. It's not right, in my view, that natural gas drilling should be exempted from the Safe Drinking Water Act, okay? Or that the fracking compounds that are used are not disclosed to the public. And I think there's some things, just going back to the fundamental leveling of the playing field, that we have not done at a national level. A lot of what we're doing in California is trying to write that, but we can only act for our state. And so, some improvements have been made on that in California with the latest bill, at least to disclose the chemicals that are being used. But, there's a huge advantage from not having to comply with the Safe Drinking Water. I would start with that. And I think at the end of the day, this is why President Obama's efforts on regulating greenhouse gas emissions are so important, is because it does really make every industry account for their impact. And so I think that's the basis that we have to have going forward. And certainly one nice thing I think about being in California is that the leadership, both with the governor and in both houses of the legislature, is on the same page about this. I mean, there's slightly different approaches, but nobody is questioning whether climate change is real. We're still having that debate in D.C. And so we're past that in California. And hopefully we can just, not only show that you can, and by the way, I think one of the things that's exciting to me is looking back, at what people said about renewables, even just going back 4 years ago in Solyndra. So I was in Silicon Valley, in Fremont, okay? Solyndra was like across the street from my company. And I just heard the sky is going to fall, renewables are going to bring down the economy, this is it's not ready for prime time. And you look what's happened, right? We've now, renewables are now the majority of new energy being added. California, where we've pushed so hard people said it was going to kill our economy. Unemployment was 12% 4 years ago. It's just over 6% today. And we're seeing some of the largest projects be built in the world, and companies being created that are now spreading around the country and around the world that are headquartered in California. So I think the California example is a clean energy environment and success story. And so I'm hoping that over time, that will filter its way up to DC, and we get some more sensible policies. Yeah, you had a question.
Yes. So great talk. And you closed by making a very strong statement about the importance of wise policy. So I wonder if you can tell us what's on the top of your wish list in the future in terms of policy.
What's on top of my wish list?
Yes.
Okay. Well, certainly I think I look at what has worked, okay? So when you look at the 33% RPS, which is the policy that's gotten us to where we are, what worked about that is we got totally away from the stop-start cycle. It used to be, you have a policy we're going to invest in renewables this year, we'll do a tax credit for 1 year, then it's gone. Okay. And so what really worked is having a long runway. And this 50% goal by 2030 is exactly right. So I think we need, and that's not in statute right now, that's a proposal by the governor. So I'm hopeful, that gets enshrined in statute. And then, at the federal level, just evening the playing field. I mean, should we, be continuing to subsidize fossil fuels that have gotten so, if the purpose of a subsidy is to get an industry up to scale, does it really make sense to have an oil depletion allowance exist in perpetuity and some of these other policies? I just think there needs to be a leveling of the playing field federally. Yeah, go ahead.
You had mentioned at least one company that provides predictive analytics for consumers to make good decisions in renewable choices. If you think beyond the smart meter, climate change models, those sorts of things, where do you see the best renewable energy data, the simulations and the data that those companies can base upon, coming from the public sector or private sector or partnerships?
Always from the private sector. I think the role of government is simply to set up the rules of the road. I mean, to me, it is like driving. It's like for us to have a functioning road system, somebody needs to maintain the roads and paint the lines and establish the speed limit and enforce the speed limit, and then let everybody do their thing. And that's kind of what we're trying to do on energy. You set up structures that allow companies to compete and contribute. And, one other function that we're doing, we have a very robust research and development program. So we're giving away $140 million a year on research and development grants to the private sector. So those are not going to, government agencies. They're going to, for the most part, to companies that are going to be developing this. And by the way, one of the other success stories I didn't hit on was what's happening with the inverters. And they're now, about half the inverters installed in the country this year are going to be these microinverters that are just on the back of the solar panel, not a central inverter. And the telemetry is so smart and so advanced on those things. Those guys know better than the utility what's actually happening with the quality of the power in remote portions of the grid, and they can actually change the voltage that the solar system is putting out to stabilize the grid. So what has been, critics are saying, all the solar is going to disrupt the grid. Well, the actual truth is it's going to make it more stable because it acts as a sort of shock absorber onto the grid. And so, again, that's a function of smart technology. Most of it's developed here in California.
Thanks very much for an injection of optimism into which we all need. I was wondering about the distribution of the jobs in renewable energy. You mentioned a high figure for employment. And is it mainly in manufacturing or in marketing, research?
So I can't speak to the whole renewable energy sector, but solar I know better because they've done a really robust census. So first of all, about 20% of the solar jobs in California are held by Latinos. Most of the jobs are downstream. So manufacturing is probably 20% or less of those jobs. And most of the jobs are installation and sales and support, and growing very fast. So we're now at 173,000 solar jobs nationwide, which is, it's probably a 25% increase from last year, somewhere in that neighborhood.
Last question.
One of your slides, I believe, showed a decrease in biofuels. I'm on my way to a conference at Alumni House about that. Could you comment?
That may have been not so much biofuels, but biomass for the RPS. And one of the things that, The low cost of solar has been good in a lot of ways, but it's beat out, under the current structure that we have, it's beat out a lot of other renewables, including geothermal and biomass. And that's actually a problem because we don't want everything to be solar. You actually want energy diversity among renewables because they have different attributes and they generate at different times of the day. And in the case of biomass, there's some flexibility, and certainly geothermal is a 24-hour resource. So I think in the new statute that's hopefully going to get done this year or next, I'm hopeful that there'll be some mechanisms that will account for that. And I sort of think about raising renewables like the Brady Bunch. You want to raise support every kid in the family to grow up and thrive, and they each need some different policies to be able to get off on their own. So, thanks so much, guys.
Thank you very much.